but here we go. Should we pray? Okay, last night, you may remember, in the first presentation, we concentrated on more theology, what do Muslims believe about Muhammad, about the Quran, about the Hadith, and what are the core teachings in that. Then in the second session, looked at excuse me, Muslim history, Islamic history, particularly as it relates to its relations with Christianity. In this third session, I'd like to talk about Islam in the modern world. What is the situation with Islam around the world? And let me open by looking at this map up here. This map shows a variety of countries. What percentage of the population is Muslim? Not how many Muslims there are, but given the number of people in that particular country, what percentage is Muslim? And the darker the country, the darker the shading is on that map, the higher the percentage of Muslims. So you will notice that the darkest section, the one which would basically appear black on your map, those are countries which are 80 to 100% Muslim, though nowhere is actually 100%. Basically, you will notice that concentration is in this area. In American sort of military or geostrategic terms, that's often the area we now call the Greater Middle East. So stretching from Morocco and Mauritania over here, across North Africa, through the Levant and into Turkey, the Arabian Peninsula, then Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and into Central Asia. That block, to which one might also add Bangladesh and then Indonesia, with extremely high concentrations of Muslims. So this is certainly the case if you're looking for Muslim concentrations, very much the heartland of Islam is here. And if you remember from last night, particularly the Arab part here is the heartland in more than just concentration, but that Arabic itself is central to Islam. Remember that the standard belief is the Quran is not created. It is eternal, it is uncreated, it exists from the foundations of, can't really say the foundations of the world because the world was created. But also it's in Arabic. So there is a sort of cultural privilege of Arabic, and therefore in practice of Arabs within the Muslim world. A fact which is sometimes resented by many other Muslims. But one drawback is that when we think of this, when we look at sort of the Greater Middle East or the Arab world, sometimes we have a tendency to confuse that with the Muslim world. And can be shown by this map, which I'll return to later. This is populations of Muslims in the world. The larger the circle, those circles are, the big circle is over 150 million. Okay, and the actual distributions of Muslims in the world is outside the Middle East or the Greater Middle East. If there was such a person as a typical Muslim, they would not be living in a desert, either in Saudi Arabia or in Libya. Nor would they live in some of the massive cities of the Middle East, Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad. They'd never seen a camel. She doesn't wear a burqa, or even a hijab, which the basic head covering. The Muslims are Malay people living in the Malay Peninsula, down here, down through Singapore, or in Java, the central island of Indonesia, or Jakarta, or they lived in the steppes of Central Asia, through here, places like now Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and so forth. Or the largest single concentration here in South Asia, along the Indus and Ganges valleys. Go further west, you get to Iran, which is, of course, not Arab. It is Iranian or Persian. In fact, ethnically quite similar to white Europeans. The Turks are, of course, not Muslim. Not Arab. And there's still a lot of ethnic tension between Turks and Arabs, because remember again from last night, the Turks, particularly in the form of the Ottoman Empire, ruled the Arab heartland for about 600 years. So there's tension there. And then one can look at Africa. Nigeria has between about 50 and 60 million Muslims, which may be more than there are Muslims in any Arab country. So, in forests and savannas in Africa, in the steppes of Central Asia, in the valleys of India, in the jungles, and the cities of Southeast Asia. So let's talk about this a bit more. The world's largest Muslim country by population is Indonesia, a string of islands here. Indonesia's total population now is about 240 million. Of them, about 80% are Muslim. With most of these statistics, I work with religion statistics all the time, so I always use the term more or less. You might be interested, it's very expensive, but that book just out, Religious Freedom in the World, gives a lot of these figures and estimates for religious population. It's certainly true that the Christian church in Indonesia has been growing very rapidly now for about 30 years. And the usual estimates you'll see for Indonesia are 85 to 90% Muslim. It's certainly now lower than that. But still, it means you're dealing with 180 to 200 million Muslims in that one country. That's more than live in North Africa. Okay? After Indonesia, you get India. That's probably the second largest Muslim population in the world. Then Pakistan and Bangladesh. Each of these, you're dealing with 150 to 170 million Muslims. So in what used to be British India, which of course incorporated all of those, you have somewhat over 500 million Muslims. Or another way of putting that is almost half the world's Muslims live right there in South Asia. So if you wanted a typical Muslim, they're from the Indian subcontinent, population-wise. Another way of putting that, half the world's Muslims live east of Pakistan, not including Pakistan, they live there. Okay, then in terms of large population centers, you have Iran, then you have Turkey, and then, only then, do you mean an Arab country? Egypt. Egypt's population now is about 76 million. The Christian population that is how many Christians there are in Egypt, is sort of much disputed. But a figure of 8 to 10 million would be reasonable. So you're looking at about 65 million Muslims in Egypt. Then Nigeria, with maybe 55, and then a scattering of others. So Ethnically, Muslims are not Arabs. So it's very important for us to understand the Arab world, Muslim world, not to quickly make this transition between Arabs and Muslims. Arabs are about 1/5 of the world's Muslim population. Also important in the United States, not to make a quick transition between Arab and Muslim. For exactly the same reason, most of the Muslim populations of the United States are not Arabs. Probably the largest single ethnic group is probably African Americans within the US. After that, it's probably Iranians. Another thing to bear in mind in the US is that most American Muslims are fairly secular. Again, take all these statistics with many pinches of salt, but probably 2/3 of American Muslims don't go near a mosque. With the Iranian population, many of them fled. Either they supported the Shah's regime or they fled after that. So if you talk to them or you talk to Muslims in the US from other parts of the world about radical Islam or even Islam, often they'll say, not interested. I came to this country to get away from all that. And just not interested. So most Muslims in this country, and indeed in Europe and in many other parts of the world, are fairly secular or fairly nominal and really don't want to get into a lot of these questions. If we're talking about the United States, another thing to bear in mind is not only are most Muslims not Arab, most Arabs are not Muslims. Now, there's the question of what constitutes an Arab can be much disputed. Many of the Christian populations in the Middle East sometimes affirm they are not Arabs. So if you take the example of Egypt, a Coptic Christian may just say, of course I'm an Arab, you know, I live in the Middle East, I speak Arabic. Others say, no, I'm not an Arab, I'm a Copt. I am descended from the original inhabitants of Egypt. If you're interested, by the way, the liturgical language of the Coptic Church in Egypt is the closest you're going to get to ancient Egyptian and the pharaonic languages. It's a continuation of that. Also, with talking to Lebanese Christians of various kinds, I've occasionally had them very angry if I referred to them inadvertently as Arabs. We're not Arabs. Says, perhaps they might say we are Maronites or something else. Similarly, in Iraq now, the Chaldean and Assyrian Christian populations will often distinguish themselves from the Arabs. They say, I'm not. I am Assyrian. We are the original inhabitants of this land. So one has to be careful with referring to people easily as Arabs. But if, in this context, if I just mean people whose original language was Arabic and come from this part of the world, that's all I mean. In the United States, of that population, now about 70% of those are Christian. Used to be about 90%. So people from the Middle East who come and settle in this country, a lot of Egyptians, a lot of Lebanese, now quite a few more Iraqis and so on, they're much more likely to be Christian. And very often we don't hear from them. They tend not to get politically organized in this country, and so their voice is drowned out. But that's also important to remember. Let's move on in that. So that gives us some brief overview of population and distribution. And again, when you think Islam, don't immediately think the Middle East, and don't immediately think of Arabs. So the Muslim world is very varied. Some other divisions, about 85 to 90% of the Muslim world is Sunni. a bit later. I'll get to what that means. Most of the other 10 to 15% are Shiite. The Shiites tend to be concentrated in, I think, let me move ahead for, get a better map. Shiites tend to be concentrated, as I think we all know now, in Iran and, of course, over the border in Iraq. Those countries did not exist with their present boundaries till fairly recently, so essentially you have a concentration in that area. Also going down into the Persian Gulf, a lot of Shiites in Kuwait. Right here, if you go down to Bahrain and parts of the Arab Emirates and other places, again, large Shiite populations. Also large Shiite populations in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, where they are quite heavily persecuted. The sort of official Saudi doctrine basically regards Shiites as heretics. So a concentration here, but also fairly large Shiite populations in Pakistan, also in India, also in Afghanistan, with scatterings elsewhere, also down in Yemen and in Oman, which at one level is ruled by Shiites. So we will, I'll get back to that difference, but in terms of the geographical distinction, it's very important to see this variety. And generalizations are difficult, but I will make this generalization that generally Asian Muslim populations, particularly as you go further east into Southeast Asia with sort of Bangladesh, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so forth, are often quite a bit more syncretic or laid back about their Islam than people are in the Arab world. That doesn't mean they're not believing. If you wanted an analogy, you might think of Catholicism in Latin America. It takes on a lot of the sort of local folk aspects and so forth. So if you're in Indonesia, for example, much of Indonesia before it was Muslim was Hindu. And as you know, Hinduism has this great ability sort of to embrace everything. Some new religion comes in and Hindus say, oh, this is good, you'll be that religion, and then we'll all sit alongside each other. That element, cultural element, is strong in Indonesia. And you still have local village shrines or things of this kind. And the villages make offerings to these every year, and most of the Muslims will do that. So that can be fairly laid back. That's also true in Africa. There are exceptions to this, but as a general cultural pattern, that is true. And one of the things about the sort of current Islamic revival, if you can call it that, is that a lot of the radicalization you see taking place in the Muslim world, and the Muslim world is becoming, by and large, more radical under the influence of the Iranians and the Saudis and other movements, is that some of the Arab movements look at these other Muslims throughout the world and say, well, they're not really Muslims. It'd be like strict Presbyterians or Baptists going off to Guatemala and seeing, you know, sort of all these ceremonies going on, and then everybody has a ceremony, and they take the Virgin Mary through the village, and there's all sorts of other statues, and who are all these other people? Then you all go out and get drunk in the evening. Let's say this is not Christianity. We really have to bring them back to that. The reaction of, say, Saudis, Wahhabis in Africa, large parts of Asia is like that. It says, this is not real Islam. You're bad Muslims. We've got to get them into shape. And getting them into shape means we have to make them like us. And in terms of, and the Saudis have a particularly rigid and reactionary form of Islam, and they are evangelizing to use that term, madly throughout the world. Saudi Arabia currently spends about $3 billion a year exporting its version of Islam. It builds mosques, and the mosques look like they do in Saudi Arabia. Go to the Balkans now. Traditional Balkan mosques were sort of very Turkish, almost Byzantine. Lots of ornamentations, stained glass windows, all these sorts of things. For the Saudi, I'm using not just the Saudis, you get these movements out of Yemen, the Muslim Brotherhood does these things out of Egypt and so on. But if they build a mosque, it's going to be one of these white austere things, getting rid of all what they regard as the idolatry. And you pay the imams. In these poor areas, the imams are often not educated, so give them a scholarship. Send them off to Riyadh or Mecca for a year, teach them. You give funding for students. You produce copies of the Quran. You teach people Arabic. You provide them free books. You provide them free tapes. You provide them free videotapes. You offer scholarships. You say to the local imam, oh, come and give a lecture in Saudi Arabia and we'll pay you $25,000, which is 10 years' salary. So one sees this sort of takeover throughout the world. And just to give you some perspective on that, with that $3 billion, took that figure, by the way, from testimony from Treasury Department officials before Congress 3 weeks ago. At the height of its power, the Soviet Union spent $1 billion per year on sort of ideological warfare. I mean, they may have been funding military and other stuff, but simply Comintern activities of trying to promote communism and Russian and other influence, that was about $1 billion a year in current dollars. Saudis are spending $3 billion a year. So straight from our gas tank to, I mean, it's true. We are helping to, not sure what we can do about it, but we are helping to fund the radicalization of Islam, which is taking place throughout the world. But again, let's look at some more theological differences. We mentioned last night there are about 1.2, 1.3 billion Muslims in the world. Also mentioned the sort of commonly agreed 5 pillars of Islam, and then sort of 6 basic Muslim beliefs. Those would be common to pretty well every Muslim throughout the world. Other than that, there's a great variety, and there are probably, the highest estimate I've seen is from Sheikh Kabani, who maintains that there are 432 schools of Islam in the world. My reply was, that's nothing. We have about 25,000 varieties of Pentecostals in the world. But that was yesterday. There'll be more of them now. So that there are a variety of schools and varieties of schools within schools. Particularly the Shiites have a bewildering variety. But if in larger terms, if we wanted to use terms similar to Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, and so on, theologically there are basically 3 types of Muslims in the world. You have the Sunni Shiite division, and then a third one, which is Sufism, which isn't so much a separate pillar alongside those, but a tendency within Islam, which you will get within the Sunnis and within the Shia. It would be like, an analogy again in Christian terms would be, say you want to distinguish Protestants and Catholics, and then you want to use a third category, which is charismatics. Well, of course, you can be a charismatic Protestant and a charismatic Catholic. The same way one could be a Sufi Sunni and a Sufi Shiite. So not 3 pillars, but a way of dividing that up. The Sunni, as I said, about 85% of the world's Muslims, reflects a dedication to the Sunnah, the beliefs and practices of Islam, modeled by the first prophet. What is the origin of the difference between Sunni and Shiite was about who would be the successor to Muhammad. When Muhammad dies, there was sort of no clear principles laid down to what do we do now? I mean, who's running this show? Should it be one person? Should it be a group of persons? If it's one person, how do we pick that person? And the various views, various people thought it's a successor to Muhammad should be in the family. So they said it should be a member of the Prophet's family. And the preferred candidate was Ali, who was the Prophet's son-in-law and also a cousin. And there was a party which suggested it should be Ali. They lost out. A larger group says we should pick, the Muslim community should pick the person who seems to be most fitting and appoint them. So the successor Muhammad, the first one picked was Abu Bakr, who happened to be also an uncle of Muhammad, but was picked largely as a senior figure, one that certainly knew Muhammad well, and knew what he thought, knew what he wanted, and was senior, one of the earliest people in the Muslim community, and a person who was pious. So they was chosen by consensus rather than by being related to the Prophet per se. And this was followed for the next two caliphs, Umar, then Uthman, and then the fourth caliph was Ali. Again, chosen by the majority, not because he was in the Prophet's family per se, but he was the most suitable candidate. So in Ali, both these two divisions about how you decide who the successor is, well, Ali scored well on both counts. So he was picked. But there was sort of great opposition, division. Remember this period when we drew the map, at this point the Muslim Arabs have expanded, taken over the Levant. They're moving into Iran at this point, but certainly have this area, Northern Arabia, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, to use the modern names. And there were fights between proponents of Uthman, the family now called the Umayyads, and his son and others, and those who were partial to Ali. So a civil war broke out. And the party who supported Ali was the party of Ali, Shia Ali, the party of. So they were shorthand called Shiites. Shiite just means the party of Ali. Anyway, there was war. Ali was killed. For the Shiites, they believed that Ali was the true caliph, and therefore his son, Hussein, should take over. And so there were further battles, and then Hussein was killed. And this took place in what is now Iraq. And you will have seen on the television many millions of Shiites marching in Iraq in the ceremony known as Ashura. This commemorates the death of Hussein. And Ali and Hussein, important sites of their life, are in what is now Iraq, and their tombs are there. So those cities which you've now heard of, Najaf, Karbala, these are sites of the tombs of those whom the Shiites believe were the right caliphs, and also that they were martyrs, that they were particularly pious and holy, so not just the political leader. For the Sunnis would like their leaders to be holy too, but the caliph was sort of the guardian of the Muslim country, not of of the Muslims, more a political military term. They weren't necessarily the wisest or the great teachers. They weren't necessary. But within the Shiites, it was very much that Ali and Hussein were very much saints and saintly and peace-loving, and they are remembered. So with the death of Ali, with the death of Hussein, and all this is taking place about 30 years after the death of Muhammad, you get this split. So at one level, you could call this, say, a political division, who gets to take over, but over a theological point as to who is the proper successor of the prophet. But even if you call it a political split, if a religious group splits for political reasons, and it carries on for 1,300 years, the evolution gets very different. And with the Sunnis, there is less stress on the Prophet's family, and much more on the question of right and correct doctrine, the Sunnah, the way of the Prophet. And in principle, who is the leader of the Muslims? In principle, they're meant to be chosen within a council. Many Muslims point to this as a democratic element of choosing the new successor. Anyway, this didn't last long. That what happened is with the caliphs we now call the Umayyads. You know, why do these caliphs, why do they have a family name? Because they're a family. When one died, their son took over, and so on. So very quickly, this ideal of the Muslim community chooses the leader meant that basically the leader chooses the leader. And lo and behold, they say, you know, who is the best candidate? Why? You know, it's little Saeed, my son. He just seems to be the perfect person. And his. And then the other conflicts and the Abbasids took in. So under the Sunnis, it turned into a type of monarchy, to some degree with the Shiites too. But the Shiites trace the ones they look to as a leader is again now in the family of Muhammad, Ali, Hussein, and down. And these are the true caliphs. So after the first four leaders, the Shiites have a whole different tradition of who was the true ruler and teacher of the Muslims, and it went down through the family. And the majority of Shia, you may have heard these terms like a 12er Shia, or a 7er Shia, or a 9er Shia. What this believes is how many of these original rulers you think were good, and when did the whole thing go off the rails? So the dominant position is the 12er Shia. That is, the first 12 imams were good and righteous and holy, and you should follow that example. After that, it went off the rails. And again, with 12er Shiites, the idea is that the 12th of these imams, the leaders, one day disappeared. And the belief is that he went into what's called occultation. It's a word only used in this context, so to speak, not so much in heaven, but in a reserved place, waiting, and will return. And this is the hidden imam, of which you may have read. The current president, the current president of Iran, Ahmadinejad, is very, very big on this. In principle, all Iranian Shiites should believe it, and many of them will, but some people just really get into it. You know, similarly, all Christians do or should believe in the Holy Spirit, but for some that's much more central and significant than for others. So, there are grounds that grounds for thinking that Ahmadinejad really thinks the 12th Imam is going to come back soon, and is waiting for that, and maybe wanting to hurry him up. by having a nuclear war or something. So, so there's a very apocalyptic, eschatological element which you get amongst the Shiites. There are other groups, as I said, the Selvers, and Seveners, and the Niners, and so on. The Ismailis, if you remember the Aga Khan, are an earlier offshoot of Shiism. And groups of this kind ruled Egypt for quite a few centuries and still rule in Yemen. Another thing with the Shiites is because of this, the particular clergy, if we use that term, are much more central and understood to be holy. And particularly descent from the Prophet is very important. Not necessarily that you be the Caliph, but if you see an Iranian wearing a black head covering, that means they're a descendant of the Prophet, lineally. That's important for Sunnis too. I mean, it's something to be proud of. But for the Shiites, it's much more central. And so these leaders, the head should also not just be the sort of political ruler keeping peace and protecting the Muslim community, but is themselves a spiritual leader of spiritual power. If one wanted to say, so those are some of the formal distinctions between Sunnis and Shiites. If one wanted to do a Christian parallel, again, that's always dangerous of how would we conceive of those in Christian terms. The nearest thing I could think of would be this. The Sunnis are more like Presbyterians. The Shia are more like Pentecostals. That breaks down almost immediately, but if you wanted just one quick image, it tends to be more like that. Shia, much more devotional. You will have seen that people whipping themselves in Ashura ceremonies in remembrance of Hussein and so on. Whereas the Sunnis, much more correct doctrine, following the laws, establishing what the rules are. So very scholarly element. So often it produces very different cultural styles. And the attitudes of Shia and Sunni to each other vary. Shia can be looked at with suspicion or worry by many Sunnis, in the same way a Presbyterian might look with some suspicion on strong charismatics. At the extreme, there are Sunni schools which just regard the Shia as heretics. That's a very common opinion in Saudi Arabia, and as I mentioned, the Shia in Saudi Arabia are severely repressed. So, and looked down on. You might have noticed, if you remember, Abu Zarqawi. He was the leader he was killed last year, leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. In February of last year, I think it was last year, the year before, the US military intercepted a letter from Abu Zarqawi, a letter to Abu Zarqawi from Zawahiri, off with bin Laden, and then also intercepted a letter from Zarqawi. Zarqawi is originally from Jordan, but is heading Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Anyway, there's this 21-page diatribe by Zarqawi. He's a Sunni, he's from Jordan, he's heading Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and they were mainly interested in the military and other aspects of this, so most of the newspapers didn't comment on what most of the letter was about. I printed out the letter, from the internet. Comes out at 21 pages. Okay, 12 of those pages are simply a venomous attack on Shiites. I mean, he talks about the Americans. He talks, the Americans were bad for 3 pages, and other things like this. The majority of the letter is about Shiites. And Zarqawi says, they are worse than the Jews. Which, in Zarqawi's hierarchy is, got to be pretty low. And that they must be killed. So that meant that in Iraq, the attacks by al-Qaeda in Iraq against the Shiites, that was for political, tactical reasons. Let's attack the Shiites will attack us, we'll start this tension and the civil war, and we can win. So it was certainly a calculated thing. But more than that, particularly for Zarqawi, Shiites are heretics. They've got to be killed. And the letter from Zawahiri, I hope you can follow these names, though they both begin with a Z. Al-Zawahiri, reputed to be Osama bin Laden's deputy, his letter to Zarqawi after this said a few things, but the basics is, could you lay off the Shia for a while? It says we've got Americans to deal with, we've got all these other sorts of things, and this plan to exterminate the Shiites, this is not a very good time for doing this. Wasn't clear whether Zawahiri said it's not good to exterminate the Shiites, or whether he was saying this is not a good time to do it. He was fairly ambiguous on that score. So you can get, at some level in the extremes, you can get sort of murderous, literally murderous animosity. In other cases, it's just, that other group, they're weird. So there's all these sorts of tensions. In Pakistan, you're getting a lot of violent conflict between Sunnis and Shiite groups. So it's Sunni, Shiite. The spiritual, devotional, experiential side of Islam. Very much a question of personal piety and experience. And as I say, you can have Shiite and Sunni Sufis, though most would be Sunni simply because most Muslims are Sunni. Sufis are not necessarily peaceful. It can actually be quite powerful and violent. But it's very much on the experience of piety. So the Sufis I know, their reaction to someone like bin Laden or the Saudis and so on would be, and is, saying, these guys, you read what they say, and it's all about war, fighting, and stuff like this, and or it's rules. For them, Islam is a series of rules. Muhammad said, you should do this, that, and the other. So what do? You do this, that, and the other. And that's it. He says, but with them, he says, they don't seem to spend their time talking about prayer. And if you remember the 5 pillars of Islam, belief in the one God, that Muhammad is prophet, then prayer and almsgiving, celebrating Ramadan, going on the Hajj. So he says they don't seem to talk about that very much. And these are, in fact, the five pillars. Sufis are also often organized in brotherhoods. They form networks. They have houses. You could almost think like the Masons in this respect, separate from the mosque where people gather together. And these are international networks, which are often not publicly known. Just to mention, these are also important features in Iraq, which have been neglected by the US government and the US media. By the way, just to mention, I have a book coming out in October, November on religion and the media, which is a series of case studies. And one of them is on media coverage in Iraq, not on the military stuff, but on the religious stuff. Of course, those overlap. Just why the US government didn't really understand the country. Believe me, the media accounts don't understand the country. They still don't. So you get emphasizing the Sunni Shiite divisions. This is also an important and often neglected dimension of what's going on in the Muslim world. Much Muslim art, and particularly poetry, one finds in Sufi circles. Also, you probably will have read around all these controversies of cartoons that Muslims do not believe in portraying. You can't have a visual representation of Muhammad. This is simply not true. That's a majority Muslim view. Go to the Met in New York. They got tons of Afghan and other portraits of Muhammad, and the Turks did it, and the Iranians did it, and the Sufis did it, and so on. So one should not emphasize the sort of religious ecumenism of Sufis and think they're all sort of, peace and love type people. That's not the case. But generally, Sufis are much more open to people of other religions. One person I know is one of the senior Sufi figures in the United States, Sheikh Hisham Kabani. It would be his view that as a Muslim, he would see no reason why Christians or Jews would need to become Muslims. He says that God has given you your revelation. You should seek to follow that, and so you get that. But some of the Sufi poets and others. This is from Ibn Arabi, but there are others, Rumi and others, who said things like this. Just one quotation from some Sufi poetry from Ibn Arabi, 12th century in Spain. Before today, I used to reject my fellow beings if they did not profess the same religion as I. Now my heart has become receptive to every image. It is a meadow for the grazing deer, a monastery for the monk, a temple for idols, a Kaaba for the pilgrim, Torah scrolls and a copy of the Quran. I profess the religion of love, wherever my caravan may turn to. Love is my law and my faith. So this is also a particular dimension of Islam. There are also other cross-cutting movements. I mentioned before that in terms of the conflict within the Muslim world, one is seeing increasing radicalization. Movements like the Muslim Brotherhood, movements like the Saudis. I'll return to these in the final lecture. But one should also note that one reason that more radical Islam is growing in influence throughout the world is not just that it's got tons of money and organization behind it, but that many of the Muslims who oppose it get intimidated or outright killed. Give a couple of examples. Naguib Mahfouz, who recently died, is the only Arab winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature. And he was, many of his books, most of his books were banned in Egypt. And in, I think it was 1991, he was stabbed by a militant and partially paralyzed because of his writings. Other Egyptian writers of a similar view just stopped writing. It's simply too dangerous. You will find now, if you're interesting sort of literature, novels, and other things in the Muslim world, you can often find them in Beirut. They're allowed to be sold. You can't buy them anywhere else. But people buy them in Beirut and you get them on the internet. But you'll find many of these books have no name on them. But they can't put their name on their books. And the books are published in Beirut and then, so to speak, smuggled back. Let me just quote from a book, The Children of Abraham by Khalid Duran. I'll make some comments on him later. Duran has himself been persecuted since. But he gives a list, and I could expand on that list. I'm writing a book about this too. But he says, the Algerian humanitarian lawyer, Ali Machili, assassinated in Paris in 1987. The Afghan resistance leader, Professor Qayyum Rabah, assassinated in Peshawar in 1990. The Iranian human rights activist, Kazim Rajawi, assassinated in Geneva in 1990. the Palestinian politician Issam as-Satawi, assassinated in Lisbon in 1990. The list goes on, and very much. So that there is within Islam repression, often by the most violent means, of voices which oppose this radicalization. Let me just close with one other example of this, Khalid Duran, who I mentioned. Duran is a Muslim who lives not 2 miles away from where we are now, wrote the book, The Children of Abraham, at the request of the American Jewish Committee. And it was written as an introduction to Islam for American Jews, and it was a companion volume to a book on an introduction to Judaism for Muslims, written by Dr. Reuven Firestone. So, anyway, this book came out in 2001. Duran's book was not an attack on Islam. He was trying to explain Islam to other people. I think some of the offense was he was cooperating with Jews in producing this book. Nevertheless, a Jordanian imam, Abu Zant, who almost certainly had never read the book, because it was 1 week after it came out, and it was in English, and Abu Zant did not speak English, denounced this book as heretical and issued a fatwa against Khalid Duran, who shortly thereafter had a stroke and now really cannot work. Khalid is in his 70s. People have strokes. But I would say a fatwa calling for your death is likely to be a factor in your having a stroke. So if we just take that as a small example, but a Muslim who lives fairly close by and for his work has suffered. So that also now in the Muslim world, one sees tremendous tensions and conflicts. And I always like to say that in terms of the battle of ideas, one should not think, or not just think, of sort of a conflict between, say, the West or Christianity and the Muslim world. In many ways, the most crucial conflict of ideas, battle of ideas, a war of ideas, is the one currently taking place within Islam. It's very polarized and it's very difficult. Okay, I will stop there. Firstly, final lecture will be on the roots of terrorism, the roots of radicalism. I was in a debate in New York on Tuesday evening. This is a foundation which is funding different debates every month. And this was a debate on, is Islam dominated by radicals? The team I was on was the people arguing in favor of the motion, that is, that Islam is dominated by radicals. We won. In fact, what they take a vote before, the audience has little electronic buttons. They take a vote before for what the audience thinks about it, and you take a vote afterwards. So the question of winning isn't just whether most people voted for you, because maybe 90% of them agreed with you at the start, but how many switches you get. So we won by the biggest switch. But anyway, that debate will be carried on NPR. All of these debates in this series are. I'm not sure of the debate. The date, if you're in New York, the major NPR station carries it on the 29th of this month. So I'm not sure of what check your local listings, but you may be or may not be interested in that. So that would also indicate for you that while I think I've argued strenuously that most Muslims are not radicals, in terms of the organized power structure and the direction Islam is going right now, we are seeing a radicalization. So anyway, radical Islam and terrorism, they're not necessarily the same thing. You could be a radical Muslim but not blow people up. So the terrorists are yet a wing of them. But the more radical ideologies we see, I would like to concentrate it on exploring those in this final session, because that's one of the major reasons that we are interested in Islam. We should have been interested in Islam far earlier than now, but now it has got our attention. As was mentioned last night, Ambrose Bierce saying, you know, war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. War has become our means of trying to deal with this. So here I'm looking at Islamist terrorism. Again, bear in mind there are many other forms of terrorism throughout the world. In Colombia with the FLN, amongst the Basques, the Tamil Tigers, and so forth. But focusing on the most widespread movement and the most dangerous movement, because if it can, it will explode nuclear weapons. That whole network of Islamist terrorist groups, which we now use the umbrella term Al-Qaeda for, doesn't seem to be an organization anymore, but a more diffuse network, a franchise, if you will. And then other groups which aren't violent but have similar goals. Other groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir out of Central Asia, the Muslim Brotherhood, probably the most influential Muslim movement these days. So that's what I'll talk about. But first, let's put aside some wrong or misleading or distorted or insufficient explanations of the growth of radicalism in Islam. Here I want to quote from a column by Mark Stein of October the 4th, 2001. That is about 3 to 4 weeks after the attacks of September the 11th, 2001. And he makes the point about many of our vacuous explanations, except he makes it in a very funny way. Anyway, Stein says, what have we learned since September 11th? We've learned that poverty breeds despair, despair breeds instability, instability breeds resentment, and resentment breeds extremism. Yes, folks, these are what we in the trade call, quote, root causes. Which cause do you root for? Then follows large numbers of quotations. Poverty breeds instability, the Detroit News. Or poverty breeds fanaticism, the San Francisco Chronicle. Or instability breeds zealots, the Toronto Globe and Mail. Or fanaticism breeds hatred, I missed that one. Or hatred breeds extremism, the Romanian foreign minister. Desperation breeds resentment, the Los Angeles Times. Despair breeds terrorism, the San Diego Union Tribune. Or others say that injustice breeds hopelessness, or hopelessness breeds fanaticism, or injustice breeds rage. Or ignorance breeds hate, hostility. These are all quotes from newspapers. Hostility breeds violence, suffering breeds violence. War breeds hate, and hate breeds terrorism. Anger breeds anger, hostility breeds hostility. And altogether, attacks are going to breed other attacks, and altogether now, violence breeds violence. I only quoted a tenth of them. And Stein remarks, breeders everywhere. A large swathe of Western elites has settled into an endless, dopey roundelay, a vast Schnitzlerian carousel where every abstract noun is carrying on like Anthony Quinn on Viagra. So, Stein's own comment on this, he says, well, this is what I think. He says, instability breeds resentment. Resentment breeds inertia. Inertia breeds generalities. Generalities breed cliches. Cliches breed lame metaphors until we reach the pitiable state where to modify the old eyewitness news formula, if it breeds, it leads. So these sorts of comments, this sort of universalized thing of one abstract noun breeds another abstract noun, almost totally vacuous and not particularly helpful. So I think we should get those things out of our mind. Also, if for the beginning I'm going to focus on terrorism, and again I want to emphasize I don't mean all radical Muslims are terrorists, I just mean they have radical goals. We should also not think that terrorists, or indeed other radical groups, are poor. They're generally not. They're usually from middle class to upper middle class backgrounds, occasionally higher. Zawahiri is an Egyptian from a very sort of distinguished Egyptian family, a medical doctor by profession. Osama bin Laden is, of course, the son of one of the wealthiest families in the world. When you get attacked by a multimillionaire, it's not a good idea to attribute it to their poverty. Obviously, you can get sort of lower level soldiers, so to speak, recruit them from amongst the poor, but generally the profile of terrorist attackers is usually fairly successful. We see this in England with the with the attempted subway bombings and others. And the last one, the people have not been convicted, so I need to be careful, but what is called the doctor's plot. The latest major terrorism attack in England, the various people involved were medical doctors. So relating this to sort of poverty and suffering is a mistake. The really poor places in the world are places like Mozambique or Haiti, and they're not producing terrorists. Nor should we think that the terrorist groups or radical groups more generally are simply ignorant, either ignorant, uneducated in general, or ignorant of the West. They're not. The more a Muslim is educated in the West, the more likely they are to be a terrorist. Okay. The likelihood is very low in both cases, but if you look at profiles of terrorists, comparatively few are, that they grew up in Waziristan and lived in their village and then went off to be that. Usually, almost by definition, they're people who've moved around a lot and often moved around in the West. So, to quote some of these, Hassan al-Turabi, the major sort of ideological leader for many years of Islam in the Sudan, has advanced degrees in law from the University of London and from the Sorbonne. Abbasi Madani, the leader of Algeria's Islamic Salvation Front, has a doctorate in education from the University of London. Musa Abu Mazak, the head of Hamas's political committee, has a doctorate in engineering from Louisiana Tech University. Similarly, perhaps the single major influential ideologue of radical Islam, the Egyptian Sayyid Qutb, major ideologue of the Muslim Brotherhood, became radicalized in the United States. He was a sort of a more liberal Muslim, though radicalizing a little in Egypt, was deeply involved in education, and was sent for that reason, was sent by the Egyptian government to the United States. He was here for a period of almost 2 years to study the administration of higher education. My own view is, having done some of that, that's enough to radicalize anybody. do anything to get out of this faculty meeting. But anyway, he did, and he got radicalized by what he saw as the corruption and decadence of in the United States, particularly as he experienced it at a Methodist church dance in Greeley, Colorado. He lived in Greeley, Colorado, small town, America, 1948, 1949, and went back and committed radical. Perhaps a striking incident, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, regarded as the mastermind of the 9/11, the operational mastermind of the 9/11 attacks on the United States. Remember, he was captured in Pakistan now about 3 to 4 years ago, and still in detention. Do you know where he studied? He studied at a few places, but there's one which is particularly striking. Well, he studied at a Baptist college in North Carolina. Okay, so it's not that these people don't know us. Often they do. They may have a disjointed view. If you're a student in a foreign country, not comfortable with the language, it can be very marginal, it can be very alienating. It's one reason work with foreign students is so important. That can be an alien experience, so you don't really experience the country, you just sort of feel cut off and not accepted, and you don't know the way people do things. But still, the idea that, you know, this is all a misunderstanding, that if they really knew us, they'd like us. Well, you know, the ones who tend to know us more often tend to like us less. Not all of them. Most Muslims who come over here sort of really like the United States and sort of often want to stay. But when we are being attacked by people who in several respects are very modern. They draw on Islam. The ideology, if I use that word, is definitely draws on strands of Islam. To say it has nothing to do with Islam is simply stupid or meaningless. But there's a way in which they're modern. They're not sort of traditional Muslims. They're exposed to the West. They're interested in organization and planning. And they develop their view of Islam almost like an ideology. It's less like a faith and more like an ideology. It's a program. And things are stripped away from it. So in that sense, they have become modernized. Other factors we should look at, these are all sociological factors I'm considering right now, is the question of what we call globalization. It's a word we've all heard, it's a word we all use. It's a meaningful word, though it's very hard to say precisely what the meaning is. Globalization is very hard to sort of really pin down and give a precise definition. That shouldn't worry us. It is pointing to something real. It's something like the integration of the world in terms of markets, of where we buy and sell, and especially communication. That the world is getting smaller. Contra Friedman, I don't think it's getting flatter, but it's certainly getting smaller. We notice this now. A Danish newspaper publishes cartoons, and 35 churches are burnt down in Nigeria. Okay, there are many reasons for this, including an increased radicalization. But, you know, 40 years ago, if a Danish newspaper in Copenhagen published these cartoons, nobody in Nigeria would know about it, or in Pakistan. But now they do. And it used to be the case that in terms of Islamic legal doctrine, again, law is central within Islam, you didn't particularly worry about what the infidels did in where the infidels lived. You know, Muslims living in Syria didn't worry if somebody in Germany in the 1500s said something negative about Muhammad. one obvious reason is, of course, you wouldn't know about it. But even if they did, they said, well, they're infidels. That's what infidels do. That's why they're infidels. Now, if they came into your back garden and your territory, the realm of Islam, and did it, that would be different. But now, with the world being smaller, you do hear about it. So everything we do is public. And the temptation now is to try and deal with issues around the world and exact punishment all around the world. So that Van Gogh, the Dutch documentary director who produced with Hersey Ali that short documentary on the status of women in Islam called Submission, was stabbed to death in a street in Amsterdam. In fact, he was almost beheaded. His killer attempted to behead him. And many people in the West now live with bodyguards. So there's a tremendous, there are modernist elements in Islamic radicals which you didn't get within traditional culture. And globalization has one effect, that they know about what we're doing and saying and thinking. And they know it in another way, that there is what is perceived as a cultural invasion. As you know, many of the French get upset because of the appearance of McDonald's in France, or French Disneyland. The response to that is, if all the French hate McDonald's, why is McDonald's doing so well in France? So you don't like it, don't go. But anyway, but there are other exports, particularly our culture and communications. Most popular TV program for a while in Iran, Baywatch. Two things in this. One is shows an awful lot of Iranians, while denouncing this, turn out to watch it. And again, if you check Saudi chat room is what goes on the internet cafe, and the Matawa, the religious police, do, high proportion of it is visits to pornographic websites. But you get two reactions. One is the temptation, you want to see this. But the other one, you say, in the end, look, they're hypocritical, they're doing it. Who's producing this stuff? We are. Not the people in this room, but sort of Western culture. So movies, TVs, books are looked at in many parts of the Muslim world. And here I'm not just talking about terrorists, and here I'm not just talking about radicals. I'm talking about any old average Muslim. This is a lot of their experience with the West. These are the cultural exports. And they equate that with Christianity. So, what does Christianity bring you? Booze and loose women. And that's very much the picture you get. Or clothing, or other things like this. That is a factor. And that's seen as an assault on both womanhood and manhood in much of the Muslim world. Both women are seen to be degraded, and one of the roles of men is to protect women, and then you're undercut in doing that. And I think that is a major factor in radicalization. It's not capitalism in the sense of, we're having this trade, that, and the other, but it's the cultural impact, which is understood to be extremely threatening. And our cultural impact has several dimensions, things to do with the status of women and other things. But it's undeniable that it has major negative things. We are promulgating a lot of atrocious. This is now, quote, Western civilization, are promulgating a lot of horrible things throughout the world. And many Muslims are reacting against that and feel tremendously threatened by it. Some of what they react to, I think they're wrong. Others of which they react to, my response is, yeah, me too. But this is a problem we face. And bear in mind, this is a problem in terms of perception of what Christianity is amongst many Muslims. So we need to overcome that. Let me also say, in terms of understanding Islamic radicalism, it can go up or down. You can have anger in terms of US policy or Israeli policy or things of this kind. But that's not really a foundational factor. The attacks on the U.S. on 9/11 took 2 years to plan, so they were started planning that in President Clinton's 7th year. Or you can go back to the bombings of the Marine barracks and so on in the early 1980s, or attacks on Cole, the USS Cole, or the blowing up of the US embassies in East Africa. This has been going on quite a while. If you look at the sort of the key movements in this, depending on how you want to measure when a movement begins, but many of the key ones, you'll find their roots in the 1920s. This is not a simple, to put it in its crassest terms, Islamic radical is not due to the fact they all hate George Bush, okay? Or that they all hated Bill Clinton, or whatever. That can drive the thermometer up and down, but the root phenomena we're dealing with goes back quite a bit earlier, and I'll relate that to some of our comments yesterday. We can't understand the dynamics of radical Islam or of terrorism without looking at its explicitly religious dimension. For someone like bin Laden, they're engaged in a religious war. And they're very explicit about it every time. That doesn't mean we should be engaged in a religious war. But it's very important for us to understand that that's what they think. They are involved in it. They want to, and are very explicit, they want to impose their version of Islam on the Muslim world. Take over some territory, make that a base. Al-Qaeda means at the base. And then try to take over more of the Muslim world to bring it together as the Ummah, the Muslim people, under one caliph, essentially to get back to that. And then to continue the expansion which existed before. So if you look at that first 1,000 years of that expansion up until the 16th or 17th century, that was the good times, when Muslims were pure and true. And we've fallen on hard times because we're unfaithful. So what do we need to do? We need to get back to the good times. Pure, faithful Muslims, get rid of all these accretions, these foreign, these infidel ideas we've taken on. Get rid of those, go back to pure Islam, restore the Muslim community, and essentially then carry on the program of the first 1,000 years, and essentially take over the world. Also note that if you're a religious revivalist movement, which at one level these movements are, they're trying to restore, revive, change the nature of Islam. If you've ever been involved in a religious revivalist movement, you'll know, who's your biggest problem? Well, it's all the people inside your religion who won't get with the program. So your first problem for radical movements is, of course, other Muslims who don't want to get with the program. And you try and persuade them, you preach to them, this still continues. And at a certain point, if they don't get with it, you force them to do it. under threat of death, or you kill them. So a central part of the movement is either to persuade Muslims to get with these programs, or if they won't be persuaded, simply force them to do it. But here, just some quotations now from bin Laden as to how he sees what he's engaged in. This is from his 1998 Al Jazeera interview, his longest single thing. There are two parties to this conflict. World Christianity, allied with the Jews and Zionism, led by the United States, Britain, and Israel. The second party is the Islamic world. He has many other things, repeated, refrained. You know, this is a religious war. Says, those who deny this deny this plain text of Islam. They refuse to face reality. This is a religious war, and religious terms should be used to describe it so the truth is revealed. This is a religious war. The truth is that Bush has raised the banner of the cross high and fights for it. That's a quotation from bin Laden. That's how he sees things. Occasionally he says similar things about Vladimir Putin, too, in terms of defending that. So, for their view, it's a religious conflict to restore the proper place of Islam in the modern world. And remember why that needs restoring. From this map last night, looking at the boundaries of the Muslim world in 1700, and then by the 1920s, having only as independent Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey, and the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. And these three didn't count. So this, and then 1924, the caliphate is abolished. This is the low point in the Muslim world. And one sees other things. In terms of measures of democracy, in terms of measures of human rights, in terms of measures of religious freedom, much of the Muslim world falls pretty near the bottom, especially the Middle Eastern world, especially the Arab world. Outside of the Arab world, measures for Muslims are quite a bit higher. But so you've had this sort of military defeat being taken over by others. Now you have nominal independence, but you feel weak. And governments are repressive. Human rights are awful. Economically, things are also bad. There are exceptions. Malaysia is a successful country. Turkey is doing pretty well. And then, of course, you have the very wealthy oil countries, Kuwait, Bahrain, and so forth, to some degree Saudi Arabia. But in much of the Muslim world, if you don't have oil, you're desperately poor. So in terms of many of the measures used in the world, the Muslim world, that is, those countries where Muslims are a majority, is not doing well. So there's tremendous tremendous shame, humiliation, and again the question, why is this? Why are we such a mess once we were so strong, when we were powerful? So this is what is drawn upon in radicals. The promise, this is, why do we have problems? Well, because we are unfaithful, but also that the infidels have pushed this on us. Somebody else did it. So there's a tremendous sense of blaming all those except ourselves for our problem, and then suggesting that the way to get back to what we were, the way once more to be powerful, the way to be glorious, is to have true Islam. The problem is not that we have failed because we didn't imitate the West, that we didn't learn enough about technology or science or rational thinking or criticism or freedom of speech or freedom of religion or an open society, and that those things somehow breed the modern world. But that we have taken out too much of that. And that has corrupted us, that has weakened us, that's what's destroyed us. We need to get rid of those things and get back to pure Islam. Let me I'll just outline briefly 4 of the movements which push this idea very strongly. And many of them, particularly in the Sunni world, have their origins in the 1920s. Which, again, as I say, in many ways, within Islam is a pivotal decade. That's, so to speak, that's the low point in modern history. Things are bad now, but perhaps they were worse then, in that for most Muslims were simply subject peoples. They were subject peoples to Christians. So, the 3 movements which I mentioned, the ones who believe that the failure of the Muslim world is rooted in the unfaithfulness of Muslims and want to restore Islam to the purity of the faith as it existed with the life of Muhammad, in the time of Muhammad, and his immediate followers. These 4 are the Wahhabi movement. You can spell that W-A-H-A-B-I, or you can put 2 H's in there. As you probably know, there's no standardized English spelling of Arabic words. So we tried to standardize, say, Chinese now. That's when we had to go from Peking to Beijing and so forth. In Arabic, there isn't. So Osama bin Laden, most people now say Osama. It used to be Usama. You're just trying to get the sound translated. So similarly with many of these terms, you take the most common one, but they're usually not any standard spelling. So, but the Wahhabis springing from Saudi Arabia, the Muslim Brotherhood springing largely from Egypt, the Jamaat-e-Islami springing from India, Pakistan, and radical Shiites, which comes later, which one finds in the regime in Iran. So let me, hold on a second. The Wahhabis, this is the sort of official version of Islam in Saudi Arabia. Also to some degree in Bahrain and other places, but they managed to be far more casual about it. This movement is called Wahhabis by those who don't like it. They hate being called Wahhabis, by the way. And I've been yelled at by the Saudi ambassador on this score. No, we're just sort of Muslims. And Wahhabis makes you look like a sect, a follower of a particular man, rather than just true, pure, Salafi, originalist Muslims. So they don't like the term, which is one reason I like to use it. The reason for this is that the form of Islam you find in Arabia has always been sort of very strict or reactionary, or pick a word. One, because it's the heartland of Islam. Secondly, outside of the cities of Mecca and Medina, out in the desert itself, they are tribespeople. For a long time, almost untouched by outside influences, have the qualities of tribal cultures, very traditionalist, very honor-bound, very resistant to outside influences. So Islam in Arabia has always been of the most conservative and reactionary kind. However, a gentleman, I won't go through his full name, but The last part of his name was Wahhab, whose dates are believed to be born about 1703 and died, I think, about 1792. Those dates are not quite certain. Wahhab found even this version of Islam, he thought it was hopelessly corrupt, and decided that Islam everywhere needed reform, starting with Arabia. He opposed every religious practice not explicitly laid down in the Quran and the Hadith. And he opposed to the Sufis, who he thought were, with their lodges and the other things, he thought they were very corrupt. He objected to Muslims having grave sites. You might know that the Saudis have been destroying all the historical archaeological monuments to do with Islam, like Muhammad's house. If it was Muhammad's house, it's been destroyed, and significant things. You'd think the Saudis are destroying them. Muhammad's house is now a parking lot, multi-level parking lot. Why? Because Muslims were going to the house, and it was a fear that this could become an object of idolatry. And then Sufis and others have saints, and they visit the saints' graves. So the idea is the graves must be unmarked, so people do not know where they are, lest they lead to idolatry. So you overcome idolatry by removing everything which could possibly be idolized. This is a theme with Wahhab. And while there have always been conflicts between Muslims, Wahhab was unusually eager to attack other Muslims who he thought were not sufficiently pious. This major emphasis on the unity of God that we mentioned before, that nothing should be put near God or could be confused with God and destroy everything which could be a possible competitor to God's role. So that other Muslims who had grave sites or had saints and whatever, they either had to give them up or he'd kill them. So Wahhab and his followers were unusual in that they kept denouncing other Muslims as non-Muslims. That's fairly unusual in Islamic history. You could call somebody else a bad Muslim if they were not really living properly, but you wouldn't call them a non-Muslim. Of course they're a Muslim. They're just not a very good Muslim. But then to say of people who professed to be Muslims, said, yes, I am a Muslim. I believe in God. I believe in the Prophet. To say they're not Muslims, therefore they're apostates and they should be killed. Others had done this before, but never with such zeal and never with such pervasiveness. So, in 1745, Wahhab, as a spiritual leader and imam, formed an alliance with a tribal leader, a tribal family, whose name you probably know. This was the Saud clan, from which we get the modern term Saudi Arabia. The area is called Arabia. The Saud is the name of the family. It's a country named after a ruling family. So, and they formed an alliance that the Saud family said they would help propagate Wahhabism, and the Wahhabis said they would justify and give the legitimacy for the Saud family. So they took over a large portion of Saudi Arabia by force of arms. Went up as far north into Iraq. I think Wahhab was in Basra at one point. And they came out of the desert in the middle, but actually took over Mecca and Medina. The area they're from was the area called the Najd, here, right in the middle. And it's desert. I mean, it's pretty bleak, it's pretty tough. The people who live there were pretty bleak and pretty tough. But anyway, they managed to come and take over the cities, which they regarded as corrupt, of Mecca and Medina. And that point got the attention of the Ottomans. Remember, the Ottoman Turks were running this whole area at the time and decided that the Wahhabis were getting out of control, and ended that by massacring them in large numbers. So the Wahhabis continued sort of in the desert for a while. And then, to some level, history repeated itself. Wahhabism was a fairly obscure sect in the Arabian desert. However, in the 1920s, in the aftermath of the First World War, it illustrates this, though it doesn't explain it, if you ever see the movie Lawrence of Arabia. In order to, the British didn't quite promise, but hinted at that, remember in the First World War, the British and others were fighting the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, and the Ottomans, and the Arabs were ruled by the Ottomans. So part of it is, well, if you help us, and Britain said, if you help us in your fight against them, you can get independence from the Ottomans. And so the Arab revolt, backed by the British did in fact give them independence from the Ottomans, but actually not independence from the British. But and that's why Lawrence of Arabia felt betrayed and so on. That this history is interwoven with that. So, but with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, there was something of a vacuum. And at this point, the Saud family decided again to come charging out of the desert and also to take over Mecca and Medina, kicked out the current rulers, whose family now runs Jordan, the then current rulers, and again in alliance with the Wahhabis. The Saudis would back the Wahhabis would back the Saud family. And essentially they took over the vast majority of the Arabian Peninsula. And this would give them prestige in that it's, so to speak, the Holy Land, has the two holy shrines in Mecca and Medina. But still it would have remained fairly obscure, except if you're a Muslim, that part of the world didn't mean much. It was poor, it was desert. And then something else happened. The world's largest oil reserves were discovered. And suddenly, an obscure desert sheikhdom became very wealthy and has now become something of a world power. The world's largest oil reserves and the world's largest, I think just ahead of Russia, the world's largest exporter of oil. So Saudi Arabia, by dint of its wealth, now becomes an arbiter of the Muslim world. And they mentioned the amount of money they spend. I think they increased it when Khomeini took over Iran. The Saudis bumped up the amount they were spending. Because remember, the Shiites are a rival, the Shiites are heretics. When Khomeini took over Iran, this provoked a lot of fear and worry in Saudi Arabia. And it was a competitor, so they bumped up their amount of money then. So, and the Saudis have also since taken to declaring themselves, and I've heard this directly from the ambassador, as the Muslim Vatican, saying, why are you doing all this sort of stuff around the world? The major Muslim centers of learning, used to be Damascus and Cairo and other places. Saudi Arabia is, a place where the shrines were, but it wasn't, the country was meaningless. But the title of the Saudi king, the guardian of the two holy shrines, and now also saying they're the Muslim Vatican, which, as you probably know, is a very un-Muslim expression. Not just the Vatican part, but in Sunni Islam, it was very decentralized. Religiously, within Islam, you could never find out who was in charge. You know, there are all sorts of positions. It's very consensual and discussive. It would be like, you know, someone coming in and says, well, who's in charge of Protestants? Says, well, there isn't one. You know, Billy Graham was influential, but, you know, these people don't like. And Sunni Islam was like that. And whoever might have been seen as number one, it wasn't the Saudis. And now they're pushing to make themselves sort of the official arbiter of Sunni Islam. And they got the money to do it, and we talked a bit about how they're spreading that. And so Wahhabi influence is growing throughout the world. There's a more radical form of Islam. It's producing conflict in many parts of the world. Wahhabi influence is also quite strong in the United States. Not amongst individual Muslims, but more so amongst the mosques and Muslim organizations. You know, disproportionate influence of Gulf money. One also sees this worryingly in the educational establishment. Frank Vogel at Harvard is at Harvard Law School is the guardian of the two shrines professor of Islamic law at Harvard. The Saudis having given $20 million to Harvard for programs on Islam, another $20 million, of course, to Georgetown to fund the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding, and millions elsewhere. A recent report by the British government said that in terms of Islamic studies programs in the United Kingdom, more money is spent on this by private donors than is by the British government. Private donors is a euphemism for, I don't think they mean Hamid, who's running the grocery store around the corner. It's coming out of the Gulf, and I don't mean it's all negative. You know, the Emirates, Abu Dhabi, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwaitis also donate money. One wants to be careful with it, but they're much nicer than the Saudis. But nevertheless, the influence of Saudi money, Saudi imams, is not only in other parts of the Muslim world, but also in North America and also in Europe. And it is very worrying. So that's one influence. The Wahhabis from Latin America, Saudi Arabia. And bin Laden is an offshoot of this. Again, his family originally from Yemen, down here, but now essentially Saudi. I mean, this border didn't really exist. In practical terms, it still doesn't exist. Osama, we call him a Saudi. Osama, his home area is the Hadramaut Valley down here in Yemen. So again, Wahhabi Islam is very reactionary. One sees this in its textbooks. We produced 2 studies of their textbooks. By radical, I don't mean all the Saudis are terrorists and blowing people up. But with that very reactionary form of ideology, it's out of that background that terrorists do come. And that's Osama bin Laden's background. So that's one movement. I spent too much time on that. Another movement is the Muslim Brotherhood. If you go back to the 1920s, the Muslim world, the Muslim heartland is under European or infidel or Christian control. And it's at a low point. The British are more or less running Egypt. And within Egypt, at this point, a man, Hassan al-Banna, began a movement whose name we now translate as the Muslim Brotherhood. He founded that in 1928. It was essentially beginning a reform organization. It was educational. It emphasized piety, prayer, going to the mosque, education, discipline, athletics, Honesty, wanting to reform the sort of lawyers, the doctors, pushing people in business. So almost a movement, across the board movement for moral renewal, with the first not too much of an explicit political program, though that began to develop after a decade, too. And the Muslim Brotherhood, its core group was in Egypt, but it rapidly spread to other countries. Qutb himself was killed in 1948. The Brotherhood developed violent offshoots who attacked the government, and partly in retaliation, Qutb was killed by the Egyptian government in 1948. His effective successor, there were a couple of other people, was the person I mentioned earlier, Sayyid Qutb, who in 1948 is on his way to the United States. So, but Qutb went back and became the sort of chief theorist or ideologue of the Brotherhood. Wrote voluminously, was in and out of prison. And again, he argued that the Muslim world had become so corrupt, it wasn't really Muslim anymore. It was now like the world, the state the world was in when Muhammad came. It's Jahiliyyah, a realm of sort of chaos and corruption, and we need to start again. So we have to renew Islam. The Brotherhood continued to produce violent offshoots, and some tried to kill Nasser when he took over in Egypt. And in 1954, Nasser banned the organizations, and Qutb himself was killed in 1966. The Brotherhood was banned. At one level, it's still banned in Egypt. As a political movement, it's banned. You cannot have a religiously based political movement in Egypt by law, but the Brotherhood continues. Everybody knows it's the main opposition. If you want to go and interview a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, there's no problem doing so. So it's a semi-legal, semi-illegal organization kept in a box by the Egyptian government. Within Egypt, with frustration that they couldn't get anywhere peacefully, you had offshoots which were violent. One of these offshoots was Islamic Jihad, whose leader you may have heard of, Ayman al-Zawahiri. That's his background. It's often said of Al-Qaeda that the Saudis provide the money and the muscles, but the Egyptians provide the brains. It's the Egyptians who say that, but other people agree with that. Another offshoot was Jamaat or Jamaat Islamiyah, another violent group. By the way, these are the people, Islamic Jihad, are the people who killed Sadat, the Egyptian president, in 1981. The Jamaat Islamiyah, another violent group, its leader was Sheikh Abdul Rahman, who is now in prison in the United States for his role in organizing and pushing for the first attack on the World Trade Center. So, the Muslim Brotherhood, in many ways, is the most influential, certainly the most influential radical organization. It has offshoots throughout the world. The largest group is in Egypt, but amongst the Palestinians, Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood amongst the Palestinians. Muslim Brotherhood also has groupings in Lebanon. In Syria, though Sadat Sr., the father of the current president, massacred many of them and effectively squashed them. It's strong in Jordan, in the Jordanian parliament, and throughout the Arab world, also in Sudan. At one level, the current Sudanese regime, one of its constituent parts is the Muslim Brotherhood. The Radical Islamic Party in Indonesia is a Brotherhood offshoot. Many of the Muslim organizations you will find in Europe and the United States are Muslim Brotherhood offshoots, groups like KER, the Council on American Islamic Relations, is one. The major grouping of mosques in America, ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, is also a Brotherhood offshoot. So it is a highly influential organization and has a radical ideology. Again, I'm not saying it's a terrorist ideology. It's produced terrorist groups, I might mention, but it is a radical ideology, and the U.S. government right now is sort of debating whether to have official conversations with the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood on the grounds that it will probably take over Egypt at some point. A third radical movement, I'm just taking what I think are the three most influential Sunni ones and one Shiite one, is usually translated Jamaat-e-Islami. And again, the spelling can vary. This is, in fact, this would be an Urdu formulation rather than an Arabic one, but it's a variation in Arabic. You would note the word Jamaat appearing. That just means group, organization. It's a sort of generic term. And Islami, obviously, most of these things translate as the Islamic group, the Islamic organization. So they're fairly generic ones. The founder of this organization was a man, Maulana Maududi, usual spelling of Maududi, M-A-U-D-U-D-I, born 1903, died I think 1979, and that meant when he was growing up, it was within British India. You know, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India were one territory ruled by the British. And there were obviously major independence movements coming up in India at this time, trying to get the British out. And Maududi objected to that. He maintained, as many radical Islamists do, that nationalism is un-Islamic. Why should the political organization be a group of people you call a nation or share a language? That violates Islam. Islam is the organizing principle. The idea is Muslims comprise a political entity. It's not that Egyptians do it, or it's not that Iranians do it, or it's not that Pashtuns do it. Who cares about that? I mean, for language and other things, it's important. So, but nationalism, like democracy, is inherently anti-Islamic. So he divorced himself from Indian independence, even from the Muslim movements pushing for independence, and argued that the only true form of Islam is having an Islamic state, and shaped a lot of thinking amongst radical Muslim movements in India. A school often referred to, already existed, but he reshaped it, the Deobandi movement, D-E-O-B-A-N-D-I, the Deobandis. That's another term you will see coming around. A lot of the radical movements in Pakistan, after the division he went to live in Pakistan, a lot of the radical movements and the major umbrella radical movement within Pakistan is Jamaat-e-Islami, and has Maududi's influence. And there's comparatively few Pakistani immigrants into the United States, but they're very important in England, in Britain. And if you're looking at radicalization in Britain, you're not usually looking to the Muslim Brotherhood, though it operates there, or to the Wahhabis, but to these Pakistani groups and Deobandi schools. And here, all these things are schools with many people involved, but if you wanted to pick one person who was influential in this, that was Maududi. And again, he born 1903, but most of his writing again comes in the 1920s, where the question throughout the Muslim world is, where do we go from here? And all these competing ideologies come in. So those are three of the major, and there are many minor ones, Sunni schools. Of course, we've had the appearance of a Shiite school. the Shahs in ruling Iran in the 20th century were not as secular as Ataturk in Turkey, but still relatively secular. They emphasized not Islam, but Iranian nationalism, the ancient history of Islam. Cyrus the Great would be a great person, and so forth. And many Muslims in Iran saw this as basically un-Islamic and wanted to get rid of this regime. Many movements, a key figure is a name you would recognize, the Ayatollah Khomeini, born 1902. Notice all these guys, 1902, 1903, where they come up. He criticized the rulers for being corrupt and anti-Islamic. He was in and out of prison. He then went off to Iraq and taught in Najaf. Iraq being, until the development of modern Iran, the heartland, the theoretical heartland, the scholarly heartland of the Shiites is, of course, southern Iraq, Karbala, Najaf. Places like Qum were not really that central. So Khomeini went to Najaf, was there for a while, got kicked out of there by Saddam Hussein as a favor to the Iranians, and then went and lived in Paris. And had a similar, he had, of course, his own Shiite particularities, but the overall ideology of the place of Islam in the world and the domination by foreign infidel powers, especially the great Satan, that's us, us in this context being Americans, not particularly Christians, though he wouldn't distinguish, and seen as the great Satan, the Russians, of course, the lesser Satan. Bear in mind, within Islam, Satan is particularly the seducer, the tempter. The great Satan is not so much someone who comes, flaming in the night to kill you, but the one who seduces you. So the image of America as the Satan goes back to some of those cultural things that we mentioned earlier. But anyway, to cut a long story short, the Shah began to get weaker and weaker, and Khomeini came back in triumph and took over the country, which was a complete surprise to the CIA. One gentleman I know, I'm getting tired, his name escapes me, it will come back. He has a very good chapter in a book by Doug Johnson, who some of you would know, on religion and diplomacy, to the CIA, that they should study the ideas of these religious types. The idea was turned down on the grounds that it would be, and I quote, mere sociology, which is intelligence speak for irrelevant academic verbiage, which, to be fair to the CIA, is a good description of sociology, but in this case, again, another story that religion was simply not taken seriously. That's not important, it's just a religious thing. And they were really surprised. That's why the embassy was taken over. Do you ever wonder, why wasn't the embassy empty? When there's a million people in the streets shouting death to the great Satan, and you're the great Satan, usually what you do is like evacuate at least non-essential personnel. We didn't. And the Iranians also got most of the secret documents. They weren't destroyed. I mean, this is quite serious. Why? Because many people in the US government didn't and still don't see religion as a significant factor in world affairs. Excuse me for the commercial break in but Khomeini took over. That's a very unusual regime in many ways. It's to some degree its model is Plato's Republic. If you've read that, you have the Guardian, you have the Guardian Council, and others. It's unusual in many respects, but one of this is that within Shiism, you had the ruler, and then you had the imams, the teachers, who said what the law is. Remember, in classical Islam, the government didn't make laws. God had given the laws, and the teachers, the law scholars, will tell you what they are. The rulers essentially ruled. They were the executive, so to speak. But the scholars, the imams, The Ayatollahs were not quite like church leaders, more like lawyers or church leader come law professor. And they would criticize the government or support it and whatever. And it was always important that they made sure the government was properly Islamic. But the idea that they would actually run the thing themselves, that's new. I don't think it's happened before in Shiite history. So the actual takeover by, so to speak, the clergy of a regime, Iran is quite unusual and revolutionary. So that's the fourth major movement. And as I say, these are not the only movements around, but they are the ones which are the most powerful. Occasionally they fight, occasionally they cooperate. To a large degree, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Wahhabis have come together. And Osama bin Laden, even what we call Al-Qaeda, to some degrees are coming together. Because Zawahiri's background is in the Brotherhood out of Egypt. Osama bin Laden's background is in Al-Qaeda, or the Wahhabi movements, and they've come together and cooperated. So the terrorist movements represent many of these things coming together. Then the people out of Pakistan with Maududi, you see those coming together, and you actually see them now on the literally, physically together on the Pakistani border. So that's with the terrorists. With the radicals more generally, there are these and other movements. But my great concern is, as I read the world right now, while radicals are not a majority of Muslims, they do have the momentum. One reason for this is most Muslims don't have an agenda. I mean, they're not actually trying to be radical or trying not to be radical, but getting about their business. And remember, most Muslims don't understand a word of Arabic. So at one level, the Muslim world is, you could do an analogy of, it's like Christianity in Europe in 1300. When you say, what do Muslims believe about their faith? Often the answer is not very much, because they don't understand it. It would be like going into a village in Germany in 1300 and asking for a theological discussion. Well, they don't know. I mean, the priests speak Latin. The only Bible around is in Latin, and you don't understand a word of Latin. So you really don't know. You have a few things, and the priest tells you something, you believe it. So at this level, much of Islam is up for grabs. Most Muslims are usually sort of not well educated. The world is chaotic. You have Western cultural influence, and there are many different people vying for their allegiance. At the moment, the wealthiest and most organized groups tend to be the radical ones. So I expect, for many reasons, but for that particular reason, for the next several decades to be very rough ones, both for us and for Muslims. And there I will stop. Thank you very much.